I'd like to introduce our first panel today. Our first panel will focus on data protection and in an AI-driven world. As artificial intelligence evolves and becomes used more widely, it magnifies the ability of companies to use personal information in a way that can intrude on privacy and data protection. With the ICO having updated its guidance on AI and data protection in March, this panel is an opportunity to discuss the potential impacts and risks that the evolution of AI poses, particularly in relation to data protection as well as potential forms of governance as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Abigail Burke, who's Policy Manager at the Open Rights Group, our chair for this panel, Lord Allen, member of the House of Lords and former Director of Public Policy at Facebook, Georgia Osborne, Senior Research Analyst at Oxford Information Labs and Research Community Manager at the DNS Research Foundation, and last but not least, Anna Maria Crotu, PhD candidate at Imperial College. So please put your hands together and give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Straight in. So I'm Richard Allen. Thanks to the UK system of political patronage, I get to take part in the... Thank you. Richard Allen, as I was just saying, thanks to the UK system of political patronage, I get to take part in the legislative process, and I'm mainly working at the moment on the online safety bill. But here I'm delighted to be here today to listen to some experts on AI and data protection. So what I'm going to do is just run through them very quickly where they will introduce themselves, what they do and their expertise, and then I'm going to go back to them with a couple of prepared questions for each of them to try and set the scene. Once we've done that, then we'll come out to you. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions around AI and data protection. So I will start moving down the line this way. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Abby.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited for a great discussion. My name is Abby Burke, and I'm the Policy Manager for Data Rights and Privacy at Open Rights Group, also known as ORG. We're a UK-based NGO that looks at privacy and free expression online. I have a bachelor's degree from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a master's degree from the Oxford Internet Institute. In the past, my research has focused on social media soft power campaigns by nation states and the human rights implications of content governance on social media platforms. However, at ORG, my work has primarily focused on privacy and data protection, with a particular focus on the UK government's planned changes to data protection law and instances of privacy harms and algorithmic discrimination. A bit of background on ORG: it was founded in 2005, and it's a digital campaigning organization with over 40,000 supporters across the UK. We work to promote digital rights through public campaigns, media commentary, legal actions, and policy and legislative interventions. We've recently been supporting work on topics like protecting encrypted messages in the online safety bill and the digital rights of migrants. We also just released a report looking at the ICO's oversight of government handling of health data during the pandemic. So data protection factors very heavily into our work, and I'm excited to be here today to discuss such an important topic, and really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of my fellow panelists.
Thanks very much, Abby. And now, if I move across to Georgia.
Hi everyone, I'm Georgia Osborne. I'm Senior Research Analyst at Oxford Information Labs, but also I manage a community of researchers for the DNS Research Federation, which is a new organisation, not-for-profit, founded about a year or so ago. One of the things that we focus on is the role of emerging technologies. We just produced a report last year on harmonising standards in the EU AI Act, which will be the kind of focus of my kind of responses and talk today. So the other areas of focus that I have is also around a sort of blockchain and internet fragmentation. And I look forward to the discussion today and hope we can get into detail about the data protection areas of AI.
And finally, Anna Maria.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Maria Crețu, and I'm a PhD researcher at Imperial College London. I'm part of the Department of Computing, and my research is about data privacy. So I work at the intersection between machine learning, privacy, and security. And the goal of my research is to study privacy and security vulnerabilities in data processing systems like aggregation systems and machine learning models. And more recently, I've focused on perceptual hashing-based client-side scanning, which is one technology that's proposed to detect CSAM content in end-to-end encrypted systems. And the idea behind this research is that we try to understand technically and rigorously privacy vulnerabilities in systems, hoping that through an understanding of these vulnerabilities, we can design countermeasures for preventing them. Before I started my PhD, I obtained a master's in computer science at EPFL in Switzerland, and I hold a bachelor's and master's degree from École Polytechnique in France, where I specialized in mathematics and computer science. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how we can measure privacy in machine learning models, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you.
Thanks very much. I think we're set up for a great conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Abby, and we'll start with the UK before we broaden out. So can you tell me, firstly, just set the scene about the importance of data protection law in relation to AI, why it matters, and then specifically, how do you see the proposed changes in the UK data protection law impacting on the evolution of AI?
Absolutely. Those are two great questions and things we've been thinking about extensively in our analysis of the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, which is the UK government's proposed changes to data protection law in the UK. So as we know, artificial intelligence is being used across a huge range of sectors in the UK already, from search algorithms and advertising to housing and employment to law enforcement and social benefit systems. And all of these algorithms are powered by vast amounts of data that are collected by people as they go about their everyday business. And while I certainly recognize that AI has exciting potential to improve the human condition, there are also countless examples of real-world harms caused by AI, where AI systems can replicate and exacerbate patterns of discrimination and bias in society. And many experts like Algorithm Watch have explained that automated decision-making is never neutral. The outputs of AI are defined by the quality of the data that they're trained on. So where data is unfair or biased, machine learning will entrench these issues. So easy examples of this would be Amazon's scrapped recruitment system that discriminated against women because the AI was trained on resumes from its current employee base, which was largely made up of men. Another example, in a 2019 study by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they looked at 189 facial recognition algorithms from companies like Microsoft, Intel, and other major tech and surveillance companies, and they found serious racial bias in most of the algorithms. And we've seen this play out in police algorithms, in algorithms being used by exam technology that universities are using, where people of darker skin tones are discriminated against or not recognized or misidentified by these algorithms. So it's clear that these kind of data-driven automated technologies have a serious impact on people's lives and require serious safeguards. And this is really where data protection law comes into play. It provides people with very important controls over the collection and use of their data by private companies and the government, and it also gives them the right to understand and challenge automated decisions. Critically, the UK GDPR does not only aim to protect privacy, but also to protect fairness and human rights where personal data is used, which makes it extremely relevant to the governance of artificial intelligence. The UK GDPR currently provides people rights to access their data, to rectify it when it's incorrect, to challenge unfair or illegitimate uses, and more. The UK GDPR also has specific provisions around automated decision-making, including profiling, that has a legal or significant impact on people. It bans that. It also requires that individuals can ask for human review and interventions on automated decision-making. So what we're concerned about at org and what civil society across the UK and EU is concerned about more broadly is that instead of using the UK's new independence from the EU to strengthen data protection law and encourage public confidence in AI, the government is actually weakening data protection law, handing more power to companies and itself to do what it wants with people's data. So through the government's Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, people will be more likely to be denied access to their data. It will take longer to resolve complaints for data protection impact assessments, which are important tools to assess the potential outcomes and consequences of using data and automated systems. It will no longer require consultation with the data subjects who will be affected. And protections around automated decision-making itself are significantly reduced. And these changes have been roundly criticized by dozens of UK and EU experts through open letters. There have been questions tabled to the EU Commission around whether the UK will deserve to keep adequacy if it goes through with these changes. So if the bill becomes law, as it's predicted to do with the current majority in Parliament, we're extremely concerned about the loss of public confidence in AI and the harm that the bill will cause to people's rights and livelihoods. So it's a really worrying missed opportunity, and it's one that's not centering transparency, accountability, and redress for individuals, which are all key safeguards for AI systems. Personally, I'm worried that we're headed towards a future in the UK where AI systems are becoming more ubiquitous and entrenched in everyday decision-making, while not handing people the tools to protect themselves through a thorough understanding of what data is being collected on them, how it's being used, and the ability to consult on high-risk processing and challenge these systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And if you're not aware, there is this bill that's going to the UK Parliament. Almost nobody cares about it, just to be clear. So I'm working on the online safety bill, and we're a small group of people who really care about the online safety bill. By the time you get to the data protection stuff, you've lost most members of Parliament. So if you're interested in getting engaged, it's well worth getting engaged, because I say it's like a huge piece of legislation that very few people are looking at or care about, as a warning.
Great. Over to you, Georgia.
So my kind of area of focus is more on the EU AI Act, which is the first comprehensive legislation which covers AI. So you can almost kind of feel the difference between before ChatGPT and after ChatGPT, in that there's been so much that has been rapidly changing in the past kind of few years. And so with this kind of first comprehensive legislation, it hopes to really kind of bring a binding legislation to the kind of use of AI, and its cornerstone is to classify it by risk. So it mandates various developments and use requirements for certain use cases of AI. Now, this is a horizontal legislation, which means that it applies to all applications of AI across all sectors, an application which is slightly different to the UK one, which is much more kind of vertical in that it sort of it applies to specific sectors. And so it's sort of light touch and non-binding for the moment, although that is looking to be temporary, I believe. And we can see this in the ICO guidance, which was updated in March of this year. So along with the kind of, everyone's sort of been talking about AI over the last year, it's really gained a lot of traction with everything. And because of that, there's been a kind of increase of the need to quickly regulate this thing. Now, with the EU AI Act, the first thing I would say is, what is AI? No one really can define it. Now, the EU AI Act has deliberately, I would say, got quite a wide definition, which is really to kind of future-proof the AI. But it's, in my opinion, too wide. We were joking that it would also apply to Excel sheets as well earlier. So that it includes software that's based on logic and knowledge, but that's hoping to be quite narrow in definition, hopefully sort of narrower at least by the time the kind of it comes through. It comes with quite strict penalties, which are similar or higher than we would see under GDPR. So kind of 4%, 6% of a company's annual turnover. And the first draft was in April 2021, and they kind of updated it really because I would say because of ChatGTP and the kind of talks around it in June, they had to quite rapidly add to it, as things like ChatGTP wasn't really explicitly mentioned in the regulation originally. So the kind of extraterritorial nature of the EU AI Act will have quite far-reaching effects across the world, which is why it's really important. Having said that, it's not really expected to come into place until 2026, so it is really important that we have kind of what the UK has, which is guidance around what we should do and what organisations should do. So it really aims to strengthen Europe's position as a global hub of excellence in AI. And as I said, the cornerstone is the classification system, which determines the level of risk. Now, I'm not going to go too into that. I will just sort of briefly explain that it's based on sort of AI that is considered to be minimal or low risk, which is things like spam and video games, and then the others are sort of unacceptable risk and high risk. Unacceptable risk meaning kind of surveillance and using facial recognition for surveillance purposes. But they've recently just added another one in June this year, which is around looking at generative AI and not using the information that it generates specifically. So if it discloses that it cannot disclose that it's information generated by AI in June. So this was something that they added. So the focus really is the high-risk AI systems when it comes to data protection. With high-risk AI systems, it's not just around the kind of technology itself. So it's not just around critical infrastructure, it's also around how you use it. Now, Abby sort of explained how Amazon's use case of using it to look at recruitment and found that it was basically discriminatory. So the kind of high risk kind of classification of AI is really where it's really important to get the data protection right. Now, we have various reasons why this is so important, and it comes from the context of why the EU AI sort of regulation started, which is around sort of the context is about public safety and product safety. So the burden of the regulation should be on the provider and also on the deployment of the AI. So it is not on the user. So it's really important that they get the data protection correctly. So the EU wants to regulate the training of AI models by imposing criteria on training and validation and testing of data sets. And to achieve this and to ensure bias monitoring, detection and correction of high-risk AI systems, AI creators may be permitted to process special category data. So this includes, special category data is really stuff around ethnicity, kind of sexual preferences, and I believe gender as well. So the idea is that there is a potential that there is a clash between current GDPR and EU AI regulation, which is that the current GDPR says you cannot use the special category of data. But in order to monitor and eliminate bias and discrimination from all these uses of AI, there is potentially a need, either based on a public good or something else, that this special category data could be used to make sure that this bias isn't taking place, such as in the example that Abby used, which is the Amazon recruitment example. So that kind of outlines the importance of data protection in the EU AI Act and how there is a bit of a tension there between using special category data and also current GDPR. So I'm happy to go into that more in discussion, but I'll move on for now.
Thanks so much, Georgia, and thank you for expertly answering the questions I realised I hadn't vocalised, which were the extraterritorial implications of the AI Act and about the risk-based approach, and you covered those brilliantly, so I think we now have an understanding of what's going on there. Just as a note on the bias question, if anyone's interested in digging into this, there's an excellent book called The Alignment Problem by Brian Christian, which is a very sort of readable sort of history of how a lot of the algorithms developed, and actually has some really interesting detail on the example of things like criminal justice system use of AI. So The Alignment Problem by Brian Christian I'd recommend. And with that now, we will move to Anna Maria, and I am going to actually articulate the question this time, which is, how do we measure privacy risks when it comes to machine learning models and generative AI in particular? So moving on from the legislation to, if you like, a more technical understanding of what those privacy risks are, that would be great.
Okay, so thank you for this excellent question. So I think we hear a lot about artificial intelligence. What is most often meant by artificial intelligence today is machine learning models. And very recently, we've heard a lot about generative AI models like ChatGPT, but also we hear about synthetic data, which is one of, today is hailed as one of the main ways to share data while protecting privacy. So when we talk about machine learning models, we describe them as solutions to general tasks. For instance, we want to train a model to detect cancer in young patients. But always, when we design a machine learning model, we train it on specific data sets. So a key question when it comes to training machine learning models is what machine learning models memorize about their training data set. And the key idea here is that ideally we would want the model to perform very well on its intended task without memorizing training details or personally identifiable information or individual training records. So of course, if a model is released on some device or as an API, and if it spits out training details or personally identifiable information, that obviously can break the privacy of individuals. But from a GDPR perspective, even if a model can be linked back to the individuals, for instance, by learning that a specific record was used to train a model, that model may, in some cases, not be considered anonymous data as per the GDPR. Of course, this is a membership inference threats like the ones I described are more subtle. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very important to have a good understanding of what the models can understand, can memorize about the data set. Unfortunately, from a technical perspective, this is hard because most of the models out there, and especially large language models, which are very, very big models, they are essentially what we call black boxes. So the contribution of individual records in the training data set to the final model that is released is largely untraceable, even by technical experts. And to give you some intuition why this is the case, the models that we train today are obtained through iterative procedures. There's a lot of randomness and complexity involved in the training of the models. And although they achieve very good performance on well-defined tasks, we don't have a good understanding of how they what exactly they remember about the training data set. So because it's very hard to do this, what we do is we study them in a post hoc fashion. So we develop so-called inference attacks. By attacks, we mean that we conceptualize so-called threat models. So we think about adversaries, who could be an untrusted entity, what are they trying to extract from the data set, what is a context in which an attack could happen. And then once we define this context around an attack, we develop a technique to measure, for instance, the leakage of, some sensitive information. For instance, how often can I infer a sensitive attribute about an individual having only access to a machine learning model. Once we measure this risk, then there's a whole question about the context. So for instance, a developer might decide not to release the model if the measured risk is very large. Now, I think a natural question is to ask is why is this more of a problem today with generative AI than it was with a traditional machine learning model? Machine learning has been with us for more than a decade. And there are a bunch of reasons. The first reason is the scale and the origin of the data. So today, a lot of data is being collected, and most of it is sourced in our interactions with technology. In the early days of machine learning models, researchers were collecting and curating small-scale data sets specifically for a task and training a model for that task. Today, large language models, text-to-image models like DALL-E are trained on gigantic data sets scraped from the internet. The main reason is that the large scale of the data enables much better learning, so they perform much better at their tasks. In some cases, models are trained on confidential or private data, for instance, autocomplete feature in keyboards or medical applications. So there, the privacy risks are much more obvious. The second reason why generative AI is being discussed a lot today is the type of the model being trained. So before generative AI, most of the models were so-called classification models. So their goal was to predict some feature of an image, for instance, to classify an image as a cat or a dog, or to detect a face in an image. And the traditional setup was that this classification model would be released on some device, or maybe query access would be given to users, which means that users could send an image to retrieve a prediction. So an adversary here would have access to the outputs of the model computed on specific queries, for instance, on specific images. But as I said, the model is a black box, and intuitively there is only so much the outputs of the model, so how confident they are that this image belongs to, I don't know, a cat or a dog. This is kind of the only information that an adversary would have, and when models are trained, are deployed on devices, then additionally the adversary would have access to the parameters of the model, so they would have access to more information. Now, differently from these classification models, generative AI models are trained specifically to generate data that resembles their training data set. So the goal of the model is different, and the state-of-the-art models, such as Stable Diffusion, are explicitly designed to reconstruct an image after some noise has been added to it. I mean, this is a technical detail, but what I'm trying to say is that by design, the models are trained to generate data, unlike classification, where the models we only want the model to confidently infer the correct label of an image. So intuitively, there may be more memorization by the model, but also it may be much easier for anyone with access to a generative model to reconstruct data from the original training data set. And interestingly, sometimes we're hearing that generative AI should protect better the training data because it's trained to reconstruct, to compose new images, so to synthesize new content based on whatever it learned from the training data. But empirically, research has shown that, in fact, it is possible to extract private records from large language models. So researchers at Google a few years ago looked into GPT-2, so that was one of the earlier language models, and they tried to understand if it's possible to extract sensitive information about individuals from the training data set. The training data set of GPT-2 was public, so some would say, okay, if the information is public, then you shouldn't expect any privacy. But there's a question of information that was maybe shared in some context, getting out of its intended context. Then that would break the individual's expectation of privacy. And in this research paper, they showed that it's possible to extract names, addresses, the fax number of an individual by interacting with a model. Another interesting thing is that one of the pieces of information that they extracted was no longer available online at the time when they extracted this information. So probably the information was deleted, and this shows that training a language model on publicly or on any data set can act as an archive of the content in a sense, even after that content has been removed. And the third point, I think, that makes generative AI stand out is the size of the models. So these models are today very, very large. A few years ago, maybe we were training models of maybe 100 million parameters. Today, these models have trillions of parameters. And one of the reasons models have become so large is that they perform better when they are larger. They also need more data in order to reach that increased performance. The thing is, empirical studies have shown that larger models also remember more of their training data. So even though they are better, they memorize more information. And finally, and we can discuss more about this later, I'd like to say that this field of research that I'm part of, where we empirically probe these models, trying to understand what they learn, what they remember about the data set, this is ongoing research, and there's still a lot we don't know, because technically this is a hard problem. Also, it is very computationally expensive to run these analyses. I'm not going to go into the details, but most of the times they involve training similar models to the one that we are studying. And I think you can imagine that in the case of ChatGPT, no one has the resources to actually replicate these models in the same setting that they were originally trained. So, yes, thank you very much.
Thanks. Extremely helpful. You've just given me an idea of a good use for the UK government proposal to create some AI infrastructure that could be used actually for the kind of testing and research analysis you do. So I hope that was a useful scene setter, very, very substantive. We've got questions around UK data protection law and the UK approach to regulating AI. We've got questions around the EU AI Act, too many vowels in that, EU AI Act, and the risk-based model, which I think applies actually both to UK and EU. And then I was fascinated by some of this sort of concrete understanding of the actual risks. I'm extremely pleased the Imperial team are doing the work they're doing, but there's a lot in there about the concrete understanding the risks. So with that, I'll throw open to questions. I think we've got, is there somebody who's doing the online question? Aha, I've got my online questions in front. So you have one now?
I do indeed.
I'll start with an online, and if you start indicating if you have an in-person question, I'll come to you after.
Just firstly, apologies for the pronunciation of this name. Osei Kagya, I believe. In an AI-driven world where data has become powerful currency, how can we strike a delicate balance between harnessing its potential for societal progress and safeguarding against the risks of privacy infringement, algorithmic bias, and data exploitation?
Thanks. So we got that. I'll come to you first, Abby, because I think that's very much where you guys work. And if anyone else wants to jump in on that, then indicate.
Sure, thank you. I think that does go back to what I was saying earlier. I think, finding the balance involves having these safeguards, like I talked about, embedded into data protection law. You need to ensure that the public trusts the use of these technologies, or they're not going to want to participate in the systems. They're going to lose faith in their institutions. So having strong rights set out where people feel like they have control over their data, they understand where it's being used, and they can, challenge any unfair uses and ask for a human to be in the loop on automated decision making is very important.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I read some research the other day which basically talks about this issue, which is really around what I was saying earlier about this special category data and ensuring whether there should be a provision or whether it is a public good to use that special category data. So one of the things that is the argument for using it is that it could increase the consumer's trust in AI. In that, if you know that it's not going to be bias and discriminatory, like such as what we saw in the Amazon case, which I believe they took a load of resumes. I think this was in 2016 or something. They took a load of resumes, and most of them were men. So it basically kind of penalised anyone with the word women in it, just because most of them were already men. So it assumed that the actual kind of machine assumed that therefore men would be kind of better placed to work there. So should we use the special category data to ensure that this practice does not happen is the big question. And if we, and also does that change anything in terms of how we feel about using it? Will people feel uneasy about using it? And does even using that data mean that we have a non-biased system anyway? Does that even mean anything? So I think it's a huge, huge question, which I don't actually know the answer to, but maybe Abby has something to add.
No, I thought it was so interesting when you made that point earlier. I think privacy and data protection experts have been thinking a lot about that tension between the EU AI Act and the GDPR, and what to do with special category data. And I think it is important that companies can test their algorithms to ensure that, they're not biased against certain categories of, special protections. However, we would really need strong rules in place to prevent mission creep and to ensure that that special category data is only being used for the intended purpose of testing about discrimination. I think mission creep is something we've seen a lot in data protection issues in London, for example. One thing Open Rights Group has been looking at is the use of the ultra-low emission zone cameras that are placed around London. They were initially put there, for an environmental cause to try to reduce emissions, improve the air quality in London. But over the last few years, that data from those cameras has been shared with the Met Police, which is not what Londoners thought was going to happen with that data when the proposal was initially put forward by the city. So I think as long as we had strong safeguards in place and could hold companies accountable for only using that data for testing, then it could be a good thing and help improve trust in those systems.
Yes, and from a technical point of view, I think I think it's very important to have a solid understanding when releasing a model or when doing anything with data of what can technically be done, because very often we hear that, okay, this data set is released out there, it's safe, it's anonymized, there's no private information, and then researchers come up with what we call an attack, where they show that a few points are enough to uniquely identify almost everyone in a data set, and therefore once re-identification has happened, then it's possible to learn new information about the individuals from the data set. So there's an attack, there's a back and forth game between technical researchers and then people who want to share data. And so how can we resolve this dilemma of sharing data without eroding people's right to privacy? From a technical perspective, there are two ways to do this. One is through formal methods. So this means thinking ahead of time, okay, what kind of information do I want to protect in this data set or in this model? And how do I ensure, how do I modify this model, for instance, adding noise to it, so changing slightly the training process, so as to guarantee that privacy will not be breached in this well-defined sense. So that's formal methods. Maybe you heard about differential privacy. It's one of the leading ways to do this. The second method, the second approach, which we take in my research group, is through empirical analyses of models or of aggregate statistics that are released or of data sets that are released, trying to understand what can be learned from this data after noise or different measures have been put into place to protect privacy. And I think that the two approaches complement each other because formal methods are prone to bugs. We've seen research papers or systems that were put out there with claiming strong privacy guarantees, but in fact they were vulnerable because there had been some issues in the implementation. Or maybe the developers didn't think about all the risks at the time when they released. And I think the GDPR actually has this notion of taking into account the technology available at the time when assessing the risk of releasing data. And finally, I'd like to make one point about text data. So the formal methods that are the most popular today, including differential privacy, they operate like their notion of privacy is that they want to protect individual records. So imagine a data set with demographic information. I want to train a machine learning model on it, then release the model. Training this model with differential privacy guarantees means that the model should be essentially the same regardless of whether my data was used to train it or not. And this paradigm is very useful for data sets like demographic data or any kind of data collection where my actions generate one record. So like, it's possible to pinpoint that this record belongs to me. With text data, things are a bit different because we use language to communicate with other people and we share information about other people. So like, even if all my texts were collected, they would not be only about me because I talked about my friends, my parents, and family. Maybe there's gossip in there. Maybe I share sensitive stuff about other people. And there's this very good research paper, which I can share to people who are interested, that tries to, reasons about what privacy means for language models. Because if we want to design language models that have some formal notion of privacy, then the notions that we have so far don't cover secrets about other people. They don't cover stuff like maybe it's okay to share information in some specific context, but it's not okay to share it outside of that context. And so the approach that they propose is to actually, in the future, train language models only on data that was explicitly collected to be online, in a sense. So like when people gave consent for their data, they were aware that this is going to be online, this is going to be used for language models, and it can be reused outside of its context. So not just any data that happens to be out there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of questions in the room, then I'll come back to the online. So the first one's here.
Dave Michelle. This idea and concept of refining protected data. So it might be that I decide you've got a long name, or your name is one of the religious related surnames. There are several. So that is it perhaps the case that, alluding to Anna's idea there of training on sets, that you're going to need an approved module, not unlike a crypto module in the high grade system that's gone through formal methods, anything that is capable of hiving off that high grade information that could, for example, influence an election. So is it the case that perhaps these services, these AI services, will be interpreted by 2025 under the Digital Operational Resiliency Act that has come into law in the EU, such that everyone's going to have taps and approved mechanisms to look at how all this processing is being done? How do you feel?
I'll come back. Actually, George, I don't know if you want anything to comment on that, because this question of when we move, particularly in the EU, from, I guess, sort of post hoc looking at things that people have built to pre-approval, pre-launch approval, seems to me like a absolutely critical one, just from a point of view of innovation. The sector is used to, we put it out there, we seek forgiveness, not permission. And I think that you were suggesting, in a sense, that we're going to have to move to a model where you seek permission rather than...
I will clarify the one that I didn't mention because it's contentious. I'll come back to you separately.
Yeah.
But we were asked to provide rapid input on homomorphic encryption.
Yeah.
And the nearest we've had was a Royal Society paper 20 years ago. And the idea is that you have certain bits of data where you break the end-to-end encryption. It's going to imply a trusted mechanism.
Yeah.
It's going to apply a side bolt-on to do the audit. And all these companies that say, well, we don't do X, Y, and Z, but we do end-to-end encryption are just naive.
Yeah. So is that direction you think the EU AI Act is heading, where you will create work for our friends at Imperial to have to do the audit of people's systems before they launch them?
Well, I don't know if I know the answer to that specific question. Also don't know if they really know in the EU where it's going to be by the end of this year. But I do think there have been some quite good solutions suggested, and I say good just because any solution is probably better than nothing. Which is they've suggested sort of having regulatory sandboxes where data protection authorities supervise the correct storage and use of the data. So the kind of sandbox kind of area where you can have that just for a temporary kind of before it kind of gets launched. It's a really difficult question. I think it's just going to require a lot of clarification from the lawmakers, just in regards to when that data it can be.
Thank you. It's just my colleague Rick's reminded me we had Quad 9 DNS we hosted in the BCS Internet group, and the second they moved out of California, German Swiss laws which were criminal were used to prosecute them to prevent the Munich putsch happening again on the internet here. And Sony have got a history of doing this total evil stuff. So the question relates also to real world issues that have happened recently. So thank you for that fine summary.
Thanks so much. I was going to come over here.
Thank you. Ian Corby from the Age Verification Providers Association. I've put my other hat on. Do we think we might be running into a big moral panic about AI? I mean, I heard maybe apocryphal story about the US military using some drones governed by AI to shoot down good guys and bad guys. And they had to ask a control tower which were the good guys and bad guys before they were allowed to shoot down the bad guys. But they just shot down the control tower instead so that they weren't able to know which were the bad guys and the good guys. I mean, we've been using AI to do age estimation for a long time, and it's a great privacy-preserving way of assuring age online, a lot better than perhaps asking big tech to do age verification, as some member of the House of Lords suggested just recently. How can we preserve some of the better uses of AI without the public pushing back in this panic?
Well, I appreciate your question. I don't think we're running into a moral panic on AI. Any AI or data protection expert will definitely tell you that they believe there are really useful areas where AI is very helpful and has provided great benefits to society. But I think you can believe that and at the same time want to draw attention to potential harms that are caused by these systems. And these are very material harms. In the US, we've seen in the last few years, several Black men have been wrongly arrested by faulty, facial recognition systems. In Europe, we've seen people wrongly denied benefits for housing and employment. So there's lots of real-world examples of this. And I think, by calling attention to it, it's simply to improve these systems and to make sure the proper safeguards and rights are in place and enforced for people. But I don't think there needs to be, calls around a moral panic. I think it's just being pragmatic and making sure we're defending people's rights.
Resist any temptation to associate age verification and moral panic. And right now, and come to the online question.
I've got a question from Mike Nelson from the Carnegie Endowment. Why should there be special rules for artificial intelligence software when, at least for the next 5 years, a lot more damage will be done by other data-driven decision support systems, for example, spreadsheets, statistical analysis software? Bad data can do harm regardless of the algorithm. Garbage in, garbage out.
Thanks so much. I think I'm going to come to you on that, Georgia, because you mentioned Excel spreadsheets. That's for you.
Yeah, happy to take any questions about Excel. It's a really.
I have to note we're in the accountant's hall right now.
It's a really it's a very appropriate question. But I would say that I mentioned at the beginning that the speed in which this has just come up, and the question about the moral panic is quite relevant now. So yes, I think data protection is really important in everything. But the speed in which this technology has not just been developed, and we'll come to you on that probably, but the speed in which it's developed, but also in the application of it, is quite key here. So I would say it's just the speed and the need for quite clear regulations on it.
Great. Anna Maria, just can you tell the difference between AI and Excel spreadsheets when you're studying them?
Yes. Yes. So, I mean, I think an Excel spreadsheet is basically a table of statistics or maybe some, information that's recorded. An AI would be a system that is not rule-based. So, before AI, there used to be these rule-based systems, like rule-based translation systems or rule-based, assignment of some good. Where a clearly defined set of rules was there, and like a decision tree. Is this feature larger than 5? Then go there, and then is this another feature larger than 10? Until we reach a decision. I think AI involves a learning from data. So in the case of this decision tree, there are AI-based decision trees where the rules are automatically learned from data. But today, what we mostly mean by artificial intelligence is machine learning models, and specifically neural networks. So these are more complex models that involve multiple layers of computation on the original data. And I think what's specific about them is that we don't understand how they work. Even the simpler models can be difficult to interpret. So for simple models like logistic or linear regression or decision trees, it's possible to peek inside the model and understand how it makes decisions. But for the more complex models, explaining them is actually an active research area. Yeah.
Thanks. And I've got 2 more questions. I've got a bunch of questions now. And we're going to run out of time. Can I take the questions together? And then we'll sort of respond to them and sum up. So if I start over here.
Thank you. I'd like to go back a few questions. Abby mentioned as one of the safeguards built in the possibility of having a human in the loop. And I just wondered if you're satisfied that humans in the loop are actually likely to help, given that they are going to be working by and large for the same organizations that are running these systems in the first place. Are they going to be properly qualified? Are they going to have the independence of action to make a decision which is different from what the AI said? And is there any evidence on these issues?
Very much, very sort of well-formed question. I'm going to move across here this way. So,
I could ask a naive question for Anna Maria. My name's Mike Flood, Fighting Fake. My naive question is, why can't you train, how big is big for large language models? Why can't you train them on, say, the top 50 information providers? I'm talking about the United Nations, BBC, Reuters, the 300 plus fact-checking sites, Wired, the Register, the Conversation. There's all sorts of sources of superb information. Why can't you train your models on those?
Okay, another well-formed question.
Yeah. So, Bojana Bellamy, president of CIPL, we wrote in 2018 a paper on the tensions between data protection regulation and AI technologies. And guess what? 5 years later, exactly we're seeing that. So I'd love you to perhaps debate a little bit from the panel. How do we address the legal basis issue for sensitive and other data? Can't be consent. How do we address purpose specification limitation? AI models are not, they're supposed to find new purpose, right? So purpose specification is old-fashioned. How do we deliver transparency as required by GDPR? This seems impossible. How do we ensure data flows globally, because we need global data flows? And finally, how do we execute rights? I mean, right of access, right of correction, it seems like blockchain, you, Maria, Anna Maria, you mentioned that, or Georgia, was you, it's impossible to actually delete data. It's impossible to correct data. So we need to do something, which is either reinterpret these principles, reinvent the rules, or together create rules, which is why I'm really hesitant to say that we should regulate AI. We need to see what we've got at the moment and how we evolve that in the best possible way.
Lovely. I get another concrete one, and I'm going to come here, and that probably is it, because I've just got my one other there. So these two, then I got my 5-minute sign.
Yes, I hope this isn't an unfair question. Neil Sharpby, Federation of Small Businesses. Intellectual property law hasn't caught up with current developments. We are already experiencing misleading activity using AI, and that will only get worse. I'm concerned about two things, really, deep fakes and outputs of AI processes. We've already recently seen Martin Lewis being faked and misleading consumers. So the question's this: how do we give the public and small businesses especially the tools to protect themselves? And one way is having a further look at intellectual property law, creating, say, voice rights, image rights, and specifically clarifying the outputs of AI where it's being used for research, because at the moment there is absolutely no clarity on who owns what.
And then the final question over there.
All right, thank you very much. So my question borders on the issue of ethics with respect to AI, so to say, right? So take, for example, if we're talking about the regulatory sandboxes, right? So definitely a group of guys have to sit down and define the rules for the regulatory sandbox. That's true, right? So when they are defining the rules for the regulatory sandboxes, I think we have to take care of the issue of ethics, which of course I think will help us to, push away the issue of individual biases. So please, how do we deal with that? And secondly, on the issue of privacy, right? I may decide to put a piece of information online, and I may say, okay, this is my information, and I have copyright on it, and I don't want you to use it. So how do we go around that with respect to AI? Thank you.
Lovely. So that's a really broad set of questions. I'm going to go down the panel, ask them to respond to whichever they want to. So we've got human in the loop. We've got trusted sources of data. Why don't we use them? How we need to entirely rewrite data protection law. How we need to perhaps entirely rewrite intellectual property law. And AI ethics, particularly when it comes to things like designing sandboxes and making sure that we don't build bias in from the beginning. Abby.
Well, I can't wait to start. I'll try to be brief. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'll start by addressing your question about humans in the loop, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. It was definitely a simplified statement from me. You're completely right. I think there are a lot of very legitimate concerns about whether having a human involved in oversight of automated decision-making can really make a meaningful difference. We've seen that humans many times are led to rely on AI and trust it more than they might trust their own judgment or the judgment of other people. So it's an issue that I don't think anyone has quite figured out how to balance, and how to create systems that have proper accountability. But I think, however you want to define it, having meaningful human involvement in automated decision-making and meaningful ability to appeal, where people can really understand how the AI came to the automated decision-making came to that decision, how the humans involved, decided to back that decision. I think that's very important, and it's something that we're still figuring out. And then just briefly to the comment about IP law, I completely agree. There's a lot of serious concerns. Over the last year, we've seen small musicians and artists, their work being taken, and profited off of by others who are using these large AI systems. So it's something very worrying and, something that we're looking into. I don't think there's clear answers, but there definitely need to be stronger protections.
Yeah, I'll also try to be quite brief, but I want to kind of really answer this question because it ties into also the ethics question as well. I think, Abby mentioned earlier the kind of almost the abuse that organisations could have potentially if there is a provision for allowing a special category data for the use of specific AI systems. And this is a really, really important thing. I think what we'll see in the next year, because I think probably quite probably not going to happen, but they hope that it will come out, the EU AI regulations will be finalised at the end of this year, but I think that's probably a bit too hopeful. But I think for the rest of the year we will be debating this question. I think it's a huge question, and they'll really need to clarify if there should be a provision for this under GDPR, and if there is a basis under there being a public interest to kind of make sure that there's special category data involved in the creation and deployment of AI systems. But I think you answered the IP question, but I will turn over to you, Anna Maria.
Yes, so I will be brief as well. Regarding the question, why can we not just train a language model on trusted sources? So machine learning models, they are expected to work well on data sets that are similar to the ones they were trained on. So if we go for BBC and trusted news sources, then that language model, assuming the data set is large enough, that language model would be good at answering questions about that data set, although we would have to see how accurate it is most of the time. But then I don't think the language model would be more useful than Google, for instance, which is a much more trustworthy news source because it gives a list of articles where the information is taken from. I think the vision behind this generative AI is related to artificial intelligence and designing models that can reason. So there's a strong incentive to train these models on as much data as possible and on data that is as diverse as possible. So that includes, for instance, books, but also conversations. So I think, yeah, it is in theory possible to train models on very specific use cases, and I think probably this is the way we should do it. But we'd still have to see if they are as good at the task compared to when they are trained on much larger data set and then repurpose or fine-tune for a more specific task.
Excellent. Then it just remains me to thank IGF for actually putting together an amazing group of experts. I've learned a huge amount. I'm like processing away now. A lot of the questions that Boyan asked I'm going to process now for a while. As policymakers, we're left with that challenge that we often want contradictory things. We want the AI, we want all of these protections, and we're going to have to reconcile it, but not this morning, I'm afraid. So thank you. Thank you for being such an engaged audience. And if you'd just like to thank the panelists, we can close out.
Thank you very much.